All right, so now it's time for the next episode of Operation Bad Wolf, and today we're going to be working on the rear subframe. All right, so today we are going to be dropping the rear subframe on my Classic Mini. Now, this job is a pretty intensive job. It's not something that you can do with just a few tools. You really need a nice set of sockets, you need some jacks, you need a bunch of stuff. So just keep that in mind. But that said, it's not the hardest job in the world. It's just time consuming. You just need to take your time, get through everything one by one on this job. Now, I'm really sweaty already because I've actually already done the job. I didn't want to say what I was going to do in this episode in totality because I wasn't sure what I would get done, but I did get the rear subframe down. But anyways, let's jump out to the car and start pulling out the rear subframe. All right, so to get started, we are over on the side of our car here. We're looking at the right rear wheel, and in order to get started on pretty much any suspension job, you got to take the wheel off. So I've already done that. I've also turned off the parking brake, so I can take these drums off. So these should come out pretty easy. If not, just takes a little wiggling. There we go. Okay, so now what we're looking at here is your rear subframe. And the rear subframe is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's a frame that sits underneath the rear of your Mini, and it has all of your suspension components and everything and connects it all to your car. Now, I'm going to be dropping my rear subframe because I need to do some rust correction across the whole thing. For whatever reason, when I did this the first time, I didn't actually paint this with the rust preventative paint. I don't really know why I didn't do that, but here we are. And in order to get this all tidied up and everything, we have to drop the whole thing. Now, one thing that you might notice is the way I have my car jacked up. Now, I have a jack stand in addition to a piece of wood here, and this wood spans the whole length of the car to another jack stand. And the reason I did this is because once you have the car jacked up, you're not actually going to be able to use the rear subframe as a jacking point. So this distributes the weight across the body of the car with your jack stand sitting across on each side of the car, right in front of the rear subframe. And you'll be able to see this a little bit more clearly once I get underneath the car and I show you some more. But for right now, the main thing is that you need this to be supporting the body of the car, not the subframe. So first things first, what I'd really like to do is try and get this whole subframe out with the radius arm, the suspension components pretty much in place. I don't want to have to take all this stuff apart. But in order to do that, I will have to disconnect the shock here, and I'm going to have to get in and inspect and probably disconnect all the brake lines and things of that nature. So let's get into the car. All right, so the first thing that we're going to have to do is disconnect our fuel lines. And this is going to be a messy job. There's just no other way about it. And as you can see here, I have my fuel filter, my fuel pump, the fuel line coming from my fuel tank, and then the fuel line that goes up to the copper line that runs to the front of the car. So the first thing I'm going to do is disconnect the line right up here, but in order to do that, I need to get some of these zip ties out of the way. All right, so you may have noticed just then I put a different kind of bucket underneath here. I got to thinking, my catch can can't really hold 5 gallons of fuel, and I don't want to be spewing fuel all over the ground out here. So if you have a hardware store nearby, it would be a good idea to go ahead and run over there and grab yourself a 5-gallon bucket, and make sure that you can jack your car up tall enough to actually get a 5-gallon bucket underneath here. All right, so now we are letting that drain into the bucket. And let me tell you guys, it's smelly back here. But this should take a little bit, and while that's running, we can go through and start disconnecting some other stuff. Essentially, nothing underneath my car is going to be exactly the same as, say, your car or anybody else's. In my case, I've got this electric fuel pump and filter. You might find you have an SU unit underneath here, which is completely different from what I have. Now, as we kind of pan around here, we can see that the exhaust has already been removed, but right here are your parking brake lines, and these are going to have to be disconnected. And then up here, as we pan a little bit farther around, this right here is your brake proportioning valve. And you can see I've got all my copper brake lines running to this. This is going to have to get disconnected, this one line right here. This is the one that runs up to the front, and then we're going to have to kind of push that out of the way, but take extra care with that because we don't want to damage our brake line. It's something that is pretty brittle if you bump it or if you bend it too much. So we're going to take some extra care with that. That's most of the connections that will prevent the subframe from coming down. So let's get the rest of this stuff off. Now if we're lucky, we should be able to disconnect the parking brake right back here and just pop out this cotter pin here. Here we go. And then this pin should come out like that. There's your pin right there. And then you got your parking brake loose. Now that kind of falls down like this, and you can let that dangle. I'm going to put the pin back in here, and I'm also going to put the cotter pin back in. I don't want any of this stuff to get lost. And then you should be able to kind of lift this out of here. There's a small like retaining pin. There we go. You can see that right there. And then this should feed through the hole on the other side. Now, this is not always as easy, but lucky for me in this round, we are good to go. And so now all we got to do is repeat the exact same process on the other side, and then our brakes are going to be free, and that leaves only the shocks above the rear subframe that are holding it in, aside from obviously the main clamping system. Now all that's left is getting to the shock absorber top mounts. Now on this side, which is your right side, it is very easy. You know, you can reach right in, grab this nut, and go ahead and tighten and loosen the top of your shock absorber. Now getting to the other side is actually a little bit more difficult though. You actually have to remove your fuel tank, or at least push it off to the side. Now in my case, I'm going to kind of move it all the way over into the center of the boot here. In order to do that, I need to remove some of this stuff, and then I'll disconnect this strap, take the filler lid off of the fuel tank, and then it should kind of wiggle its way into the center. All right, and with that out of the way, we now have good access to the top of the strut tower. Now, looking into this here, let's make sure you guys can see all of this. All right, so I turned up the exposure a little bit on that so you can see, but here is the left wheel, and funny enough, I'm pretty sure that this is the original color of my car. It's like kind of a tealish color. I don't know for sure, but this is probably the only part of the car that hasn't been coated and covered since I have owned this car. I'm most likely going to cover this up. I'm going to paint this, and then I'm also going to put some sound deadener down over here. I never did before because I didn't want to take the fuel tank out. Now that it's out, it's a good opportunity to do this. Additionally, there were a few things that I took off of the fuel tank. You have your leads to connect to your actual fuel gauge. This allows you to tell how much fuel you have in your car. Up here is a vent tube. Now at the top of the fuel tank, there's a small hole that allows air to vent out. And if this is not connected and run down to the bottom of your car outside, what's going to end up happening is that you're going to get a lot of fuel fumes in your car and in your trunk and all of that. It's really not great. Make sure that you either disconnect this, or if it doesn't have one, you can run one after you put the tank back in. All that's left is to go ahead and take off this strut tower. Okay, so now we have the shock absorbers disconnected. As you can see here, they're just kind of free. I also went ahead and pulled my springs and high-lows out. They kind of fell loose, obviously, when this thing became free. So there's no sense in those just sitting there dangling around, adding weight to this whole, dealio that we have to do here. So the next thing that we've got to do is really start disconnecting the bolts that hold the subframe itself on. Now, Once you've reached this stage, you are going to want to double, triple, and quadruple check that you have all of your lines disconnected, that you have all of your suspension components that hold it to the body of the car disconnected, because if you miss any of those, it's gonna cause some damage. It's either gonna pull some lines down and break those, or it's gonna get stuck up. It's just not gonna be fun. I am going to take these nuts right here off of the panel that covers this here. Now, that cover really is supposed to be covering a grease nipple that goes in right there. On my car, because I'm a total goober, I put the grease nipples inwards. I'll show you guys that in a little bit more detail once I get the subframe down. But from here, let's take these off and get a look at the actual mounting system that holds the subframe up. All right, so in a lovely turn of events, the bolt that holds on this bracket right here, sitting right here, has completely sheared off and broken. This is a beautiful reason why you should use stainless grade 8 bolts. This is just so frustrating because now that's like perfectly flush on the body of my car, so I'm gonna have to drill and tap that before I put that dumb panel back on. But on the upside, at least it doesn't prevent me from taking the subframe out. Now what we're looking at is your radius arms right here. You have what should be a grease nipple right here on the end of your radius arm. This is where you would service it. In my case, it's on the other side because I messed up. And then right here is your actual mount to the body of the car. Now, this has 2 bolts in it, one on the top and one on the bottom. And then you have the same setup on the other side. And then right back here, you have effectively the same concept. It's got a poly bush inside here, or in my case, it looks like it's still rubber. I thought I'd replace those for poly, but this is a good opportunity to get those fixed up. And then 2 bolts. So it has the rubber bushing, 2 bolts, same thing on the other side. And the ones on the rear, you actually disconnect from inside the boot. So let's get in there. I'll show you exactly the bolts I'm talking about. And what you can see here are 2 nuts directly on the boot floor. And these are what are holding up the back of your subframe. So what I like to do at this point is to prop a jack underneath the rear of the subframe, because the subframe can actually kind of pivot downwards, which is extremely helpful because we can disconnect these rear ones without disconnecting the front, lower it down slowly in the back, and then repeat the process for the front ones using the jack at the front. So I'm going to pull the camera out and let's drop this subframe. Awesome. So there it is. There is the rear subframe in all its glory. And mine, as you can tell, is extremely rusty. So that's definitely going to have to change. I am thinking I might actually bring this somewhere and get them to blast it for me, and then I can just coat it when I'm done. All right, so the last thing I want to show you guys is simply how to take the radius arm off of your rear subframe. I've kind of disassembled all the other stuff already. On this back side here, you have your mounting brackets that hold this up to the body of the car. Now, this section right here often has some rubber or poly in it. In my case, it looked like I actually had some black poly in it, and I'm probably gonna upgrade this with that purple poly that's a little bit stronger. But in my case, this stuff came off pretty easily. Yours might not. These sit into these mounts just like this, and that is kind of how it reduces the vibration in the bottom of your car there. That said, this nut just comes right off, and then you slide the rubber or poly system off of your rear subframe. The same thing can be said for the piece up here at the top, but the bolt is on the inside. So what that means is you have to take your radius arm off. Now, to do that, most radius arms, and the way that these are set up, have a soft brake line right here, and that runs from a bracket inside the subframe out to the radius arm, and then you have your hard line, usually, that runs down to the rear drum. Pretty straightforward stuff, but first you're going to want to disconnect the hard line, kind of move it off to the side, and then we're going to disconnect the mounted bracket soft line here. Some cars might just have a soft line that runs all the way down to the bottom, but the proper way to set this up is with a soft line here and then a hard line to the end. All right, that's disconnected, and that can just kind of be set off to the side there. The next step is to disconnect the two nuts that run to the ends of your pivot joint here. Now these take a pretty big socket. They take a 3/4 that slides on here, and then you'll simply loosen that nut. And you'll need to do the same thing on the inside bracket as well. Now after you've done that, the next step is to disconnect the outer camber bracket. Now, some cars will come equipped with one that has some adjustment here, and that allows you to adjust your rear camber. Mine is a fixed camber bracket, and I can't remember what the fixed degree of camber that this comes with, but I tried the adjustable one. I found it to be kind of a pain in the butt, and I decided I just wanted to get a fixed bracket. It's a little bit more aggressive than the standard stance, but it's fixed. I never have to think about it. Just set it on, tighten it down, and then you have the camber you want. And these nuts are a 1/2 inch, and they're nice and crusty on my car. I'm sure they will be on most people's. All right, that bracket comes off. I'm gonna set that off to the side. This is gonna get a nice cleanup. And then from here, you should be able to kind of just lift your radius arm off. Now, in my case, this pivot joint didn't really want to come with it. There we go. And so there we have it, our radius arm. This is the pivot joint. As you can see, it's very clean, very greasy. This is a messy, smelly job. You're gonna want to try and keep this stuff together just so that it doesn't go anywhere, doesn't get lost. But I'm definitely gonna have to service this stuff. The dust shields on these are pretty much completely disintegrated, and that's no good, so that's definitely gonna have to get cleaned up. Now, one thing I do recommend doing is returning the nuts to the ends of this pivot joint, just so it doesn't get lost, it doesn't fall out, get damaged in any way. All right, and I can take this, set it off to the side. And with that out, the last thing we can do is disconnect the nut that's back here that's holding on this mount outside here. That slides off, and then by some miracle, this poly just comes right off. It's pretty wonderful, because if I remember correctly, that stuff was pretty much solidly mounted on there without any sort of play when I took that off the first time. And there we have it. It's all disassembled, it's all empty. The only thing left are these brake lines. There's the soft ones that run here, and then the hard lines that run all the way to the proportioning valve. Those will maybe get disconnected, I'm not sure. I guess I do kind of want to if I want to get that all cleaned up. But from here, all that's left is to recondition the subframe. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for this episode of Classic Mini DIY. Hope you found this information helpful. The rear subframe is a job that a lot of people have to do on their Minis. It's pretty much one of those things that if you're restoring the car, you're almost definitely gonna have to drop at least the rear subframe. Thankfully, I don't have to drop the front subframe on this rebuild. That would be something that I'm really not in the mood to do. It's in good shape. I don't see any reason to pull that out. It's not rusty. The coating that I put on it when this first went in is really holding up well, and there's not really anything I have to service behind that. So if you have any questions about the subframe job, if anything that I didn't make sense, feel free to post them in the comment section below. I'd love to hear from you guys, and I love to hear about the projects that you're working on. Other than that, a big thank you to 7 Mini Parts for providing the parts you see on this channel. Anything that I use in these episodes can always be found in the description below. Those are links that go straight to 7 Mini Parts, where you can pick up the parts used in any of the episodes. The next episodes that are coming up are likely going to be gearbox and engine related. We're gonna dive back into that part of the job and really get this stuff dialed in. I had a little bit of a problem, which you guys will see in the engine build video that's coming up here relatively soon, and it'll explain what was going on. But needless to say, there's a reason I did the subframe next instead of continuing on with the engine. But that wraps up this episode. If you're interested in supporting the channel, head over to my Patreon. Any amount is helpful, and it shows me that you guys value what I'm doing out here on this car on a regular basis for you. But with that, until next time, enjoy those minis and motor on.